And if you want to zoom in, you just zoom in like
She said, if I don't take it out, this is my girl.
We watched you, and I
use that same guy when we bought it. Had to get a new one when our own one broke. Those guys.
But with my bare eyes, I go, yes, that's John. They're doing a great job. You know,
all the way up.
Well, I mean, yeah, you can just put it in the chair next to you. Yeah, that's good.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to get started. I am Jerry Rabideau. I came around and tried to meet and greet many of you guys as you were walking in. Those of you that are just coming in, I didn't get a chance to greet with you, but I want to welcome you. I want to thank you for engaging into this process. This first session is going to be a work session, so it's going to be a very much engaging learning session for the board, for us to be able to start asking some questions and getting some information. So we will be providing you time at the 7 o'clock meeting for community input and your input. So I know that probably many of you are going to have some of the same and similar comments, and that will be fine. But we'll make sure everybody is heard, and even if there's some time at the very, very end of our meeting, like we did the last time, we can open some time slots there as well. But I just want to encourage everybody to be civil and be respectful. We realize that it was a very long and grueling process through the planning part, but obviously we're going to be very, very civil through this process. So thank you again and welcome. And Gordon's going to take over a little bit from here as our board goes into a work session at this point.
Sure. So what I thought we would do is actually move right into having Lucas give you kind of an update into, where we started, how we got to this point. And then I thought maybe Ron Bolche could spend a little time talking about the Planning Commission resolution and where that is. Kevin Keefe, our township engineer, is here. So as you start to just have some questions, again, it's kind of meant to be a workshop session. So, and since I've got, you tell me when to click through it.
Okay. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Awesome. Thanks. My name is Lucas Hill, Community Development Director for Spring Lake Township, and Gordon asked me to give you guys a summary of the process and how it all started from the beginning. So, Gordon, if you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. So the 22 master plan update, that process was started in 2020. It was initiated primarily through the redevelopment ready communities process, the RRC process through the MEDC. We also have a 5-year master plan review requirement that's through the state law. Pretty much what that means is, hey, we want to make sure, the state wants to make sure that your master plans aren't getting dusty, and you're following those and you're working with those. And so that 5-year process you don't have to get into it super deep, but you could do a master plan rewrite every 5 years if you want. But so at any rate, in 2020, we decided to open up the master plan and begin that 2-year process. That included a community opinion survey that was sent out. We also had notices in our newsletter, website, Facebook, and we had a public hearing on the master plan as well. It was adopted on November 14th of 2022. Next slide, please. As right towards the tail end of that process, the Poole family approached Spring Lake Township and requested us to look at that region and their properties, or the blueberries, west of West Spring Lake Road. And so the Planning Commission decided to do that and look at that area. And as we got further into that discussion, it became apparent that we really need to understand what's on the ground and what's in the ground infrastructure-wise. And that's when we worked with Kevin Keefe, our township engineers, who's here to my right, to conduct a sewer study. And that sewer study really was the eye-opener for the township, and laying out what's in the ground, what has capacity, and also looking at areas that have potential capacity or don't, where sewer lines may or may not be today. So really what came out of that is a solid basis and data for making decisions. And because of that study, it gave in my opinion, gave the Planning Commission much more confidence in the decisions that they were making. So along with some major changes due to infrastructure, there was also the changes supported some of those opinions that were founded in the survey, such as rural preservation. So it was really, two things were accomplished through that sewer study, which I think is just a well-documented study. So Kevin is here if you have any questions about that sewer study. But at the end of the day, 621 acres were taken out of medium density residential that designation and put into the rural residential designation. So That was based on sewer availability, capacity, along with the community opinion survey. Next slide, please.
Before I go to the next slide, too, if you have questions along the way, feel free to just jump right in. So if something comes up and you say, hey, tell me more about that, please do. Okay.
Absolutely. Feel free to jump in. And so this next map really is the, I don't have the pointer, Gordon does here, but you can see on the left side, that was the previous future land use map. And then on the right side is the newly adopted future land use map. And so in simple terms, there is a sewer line that runs up West Spring Lake Road that has capacity. There is not a sewer line that runs up 168th Avenue at this point in time. So instead of having these islands of ag or rural residential on the left, there's been the way this was divided out was based on infrastructure. And so along with that, on the new future land use map, along 168, that land development pattern and some of the wetland issues that are out there, just to pull sewer up 168 would be a tremendously expensive endeavor. So in Spring Lake Township, as you know, it's a developer pays for sewer extensions. And so as we looked at that space, it looked very challenging to really pull sewer up 168. So this is where the divisions were made. And so that the orange area along West Spring Lake Road, that's the medium density designation. And through the study, that it was determined that those spaces could be served. Not necessarily all of that space, but those areas have availability to the sewer. Any questions on those maps?
So when you look at the sewer survey availability, is there an estimate number of like we can support X amount of houses based on X amount of capacity? Like how much capacity do we know that we have?
Yeah, we went through and kind of calculate based on areas of acreage and how many homes that it could support. And the existing system that's in place since the early 70s was sized for an appropriate number. We can backtrack on how many homes could be in that service area. So that's what we kind of use to evaluate that, to say, hey, there's X number of homes that could be supported without having to put a new pump station in or a new line under Smith's Bayou and that side of things.
It's a little hard to hear back here.
Sorry.
So do we know that number?
Yeah, in that report we went through, and currently there's the original pump stations in that area are sized for approximately 1,500 homes. And right now there's 900 that are connected to the sewer. And then another 200 in areas where they're along Hickory and Taft where there isn't sewer available that are additional homes in there.
So you're saying there are currently 900 homes hooked up to the sewer and
Correct.
the capacity is 1,500?
Correct.
And then,
So the concern was when you started spreading that, as Lucas mentioned, along 168th Avenue and opening up more properties to that, then that number would be exceeded.
thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so Lucas, do you have public engagement through these processes of the sewer revisions, or when you visit the sewer, is it just primarily the office doing this, or do we have any other backup to this, or is it primarily our?
So when the request was made by the Poole family to look at this area, then the planning commission was reviewing this and said, we really need to know what our capacity is for that region. So that really kind of pushed pause on that master plan process for 3-4 months while the study was being completed. And then information was brought back to the Planning Commission for review and input. So there wasn't a specific engagement process for the sewer site itself.
But for the revisions of the
future land use map, yes. So, next slide, please. So this gives you.
Okay, what? Quick question. This is a work session.
Okay, I thought you said that we could ask questions.
No. This is for the board. There's going to be. I promise you will have ample time. This is okay. Thanks.
So this map really opens it up. So in between West Spring Lake Road all the way to North Outer Dunes and Hoffmaster State Park to illustrate what I think the Planning Commission's goal was to create some balance given the community opinion survey and along with the sewer study. So the light green area, this is 500 acres. That space is not served, and the community came to the Planning Commission and expressed that interest in making sure that that space remained rural in character. The 390 acres to the south, that entire space that's beige there, that was orange at one point in time. So the Planning Commission, because of the community opinion survey, moved that from medium density to the rural residential designation. These were all supported by the board back when the master plan was adopted back in 2022. So that's really the layout, and I think again the interest there is creating some balance and making sure that the existing infrastructure was going to be fully utilized as well.
So we're still talking about the master plan, not the
Correct.
zoning ordinance. I'm pretty sure everybody knows the difference, but I just.
Yep. Thank you. So moving into the rezoning request, in March of 2020, after the master plan was adopted, the Poole family sold the property to P5 Land Investments LLC. So that happened early, I believe it was early 2023, and shortly thereafter they applied for rezoning to the township to essentially match up with what the master plan had as medium density residential. So as part of that process, which has happened before, the township took a look at that, the Planning Commission, and said, well, instead of just looking at the 97 acres that encompass the Poole farm, why not look at the entire region and seek some consistency with land use allowances and patterns. And so there was an additional area that was incorporated. And so that happened between the March and April meeting. So we can jump to the next slide. So the area that's outlined in red, that encompasses the entire area that was noticed for the rezoning in April. And you'll see little circles with X's on them. And those represent the P5 properties that are under their ownership today. So that was the idea there, was to create some consistency, throughout the whole region in that section. And so we can go to the next slide, please. As part of that process and through those public hearings, this basically summarizes most of the concerns by the public. And I do have these categorized a little bit, so we have the left side and the right side, and I'll explain what I mean. Is everything on the left side, we talk about traffic, stormwater, hydrology, schools, noise, lighting, and wetlands, things of that nature. So we heard a lot of comments on that. So many of those things are going to be reviewed with very fine detail if and when a development comes before you. So traffic studies will be conducted, stormwater permits are required to ensure stormwater is managed properly, doesn't create any detrimental impacts. School overcrowding, we worked with the superintendent of schools to discuss that. Noise lighting, and wetlands. We have ordinances on the books that address those concerns. The four on the right, loss of wildlife, rural character, crime, and property values. Those are items that aren't reviewed and discussed as part of the development process. So I think those are a bit more intrinsic and quality of life issues that are to be considered.
Lucas, one question on the items on the right. You said that it's, I'm paraphrasing you, just trying to understand, but I think I heard you say that it's not part of the normal process to evaluate those items as part of a PUD evaluation. Is there any reason why we couldn't evaluate them? Why the Planning Commission couldn't evaluate them as part of that process?
I mean, I think I think the door is open. It's not typical, you know. And in the last few developments that we've looked at, that crime and property values and wildlife just really didn't come to the top. With wildlife, maybe there was some. If there's a tremendous amount of wetlands that are there, and saying, okay, how can we maintain these wetlands in a functional state? Because when they become fragmented within a development, they start to lose their functionality. So we might cross some of those bridges and discuss that. But overall, it's not something that's really risen to the top.
Okay, so it's just not part of the normal process.
Correct. Okay. And then with loss of rural character, I mean, I think that was a really kind of master plan discussion that occurred. So not so much during the development review.
So your kind of counter argument to that is, yes, we're redeveloping this 97, but look at all this land that we gave back to RR that we designated that could have been R2. So you're saying, look at all this, we're just taking a little bit of this too. So, and I think when we talk about development, it's kind of a frustration is it the chicken before the egg or the cart before the horse? Because everyone wants to talk to us about the development, but we're really just talking about rezoning.
Right.
And we can talk about these issues, but we say, well, we got you in the next phase, just get us to the next phase. So.
Yeah. So that's correct. In the rezoning process, we really don't focus. We have criteria that we look at, and what we need to do is a relative amount of due diligence. So if there's a traffic concern, we do, like we did, is reach out to the road commission and say, there is a concern about capacity on these streets. And so we did that, and they felt that there was capacity for a development. But they said, well, there might be a need to improve some intersections. But capacity-wise, it's there. So if the response was, we don't have capacity, we'd be an entirely different vote right now, I believe.
Could I just expand on those factors a little bit? I agree with Lucas. We consider all of those factors, especially though I'm looking at both, but they're both on the left. Those on the left absolutely are considered. Now, we don't get into the fine detail of how we're going to regulate them, because that would be the next step if we get there. But there has to be the ability to regulate them in order to even get to the detail. If we get the big picture report from the road commission that there's not road capacity, that's a deal breaker. If Kevin says we don't have sanitary sewer capacity, that stops things right then. If we get the reports that we have the capacity, we can keep moving potentially, but we're not going to study about, well, how are we going to do that extension of the sanitary sewer? How are we going to do the water connections? We're not going to do that until we have the development plan in front of us and we do the fine detail. Now, as to those on the right, those factors are considered, but again, I agree with Lucas. It's a different kind of consideration. You can't take a vacant field and build houses without having some impact on wildlife. It can't, there will be an impact, certainly. And an empty field versus a housing development, one looks more rural and one looks less rural, and that's just a fact. On the other hand, if we get a report that we've got an endangered species in there, that's a deal breaker, or a deal stopper, or a deal delayer anyway. And property values, we're not going to I've never had the planning commission say, how can we get the most value out of this land? We've never done that. I agree with that. But other than that, if there is evidence of something extraordinary with those other factors, absolutely the planning commission will consider them. But they can't react effectively to just, well, it'll have an impact on wildlife. Yeah, it will. But that was true from the first house being built in the township. And it's still true, and it will always be true. And if that's the criteria, I'm not sure where we go.
Okay, next slide. So getting to the reason we're here tonight is the Planning Commission has made a recommendation to the board, and that's expressed through a resolution that Mr. Bolche has prepared for you, and you had a chance to review that. So the resolution is supportive of the P5 properties to be rezoned to the R2 medium density in the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. The resolution recommends not rezoning the additional 150 acres that was initiated by the township. And so I believe if I were to say that, that might be, that was considered a concession given the feedback from the community on the rezoning. So if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Bolche, the township board has room to follow those recommendations or not, or may send it back to the planning commission potentially. But that's what's on the table tonight.
And the board has full discretion to totally follow, totally reject, or do whatever it wants in between those polls with regard to the rezoning.
I think I have one more slide, Gordon.
Actually, you got a couple.
Do I?
I can see the next
Okay. So these are just some basic information for your consideration. Is that the township needs to look closely at the criteria, and that's really where your basis for approval or denial should come from. Is the criteria within the zoning ordinance, which Ron outlined in his resolution. And then again, we already covered this, but a rezoning does not require a site plan. So we're not getting into the details of the layout of the development and where things will be in that level. So, and again, with plan unit development, so in Spring Lake Township, any large scale development has to go through a PUD process. And within that PUD process, there's also public hearings, and PUD requires 1,000-foot notice, which is much greater than the standard notice of 300 feet. And so 1,000-foot notice, that means every property within 1,000 feet of this property will be notified of those hearings. So a couple other items with PUDs, there is a 20% minimum open space requirement, and that open space is defined within the zoning ordinance. What types of things can and cannot be open space. And there's also a requirement that 50% of the property will have a tree canopy. So there's going to be a significant effort in creating a new canopy at this location. if and when it goes through that process with the PUD. The other item that was brought up with the PUD is that there's also a buffer requirement along the county road. So I believe it's, I forget the number, it's 50 or 100 feet of a vegetated buffer that will go along the county road. So those are some of the lessons we've learned through in the past, that those types of things add value, and so there should, to a certain extent, it doesn't mean you're not going to see the development from the county road. It just means there's going to be vegetation in between and create some privacy between the roadway and the development. So with that, that's my presentation, so we can jump into questions or clarify anything.
And we'll have more, certainly more time to just talk about this. I thought maybe Attorney Molchi could just talk about the resolution that was passed by the Planning Commission, just to kind of get some more. I think you all received a copy of that.
Yes.
And then what I thought would make some sense is just to ask some questions of Kevin and Lucas and Ron, and get a sense of what other information we might need, if there are other studies that you're going to want to have done, whatever those kinds of things are. We've got the team here to be able to put that together.
Well, I honestly will not read the resolution to you. I assume you've all done that, and as exciting as it is, let's bypass that possibility. But just big picture, whenever the Planning Commission is considering the rezoning request, the zoning ordinance says these are the factors the Planning Commission and ultimately you as the decision makers must consider. You can't do rezonings as a township and have them defensible and coherent and legitimate without following factors. We don't just do it on the basis of this looks good. So we have to consider the factors that are listed in the zoning ordinance. In courts of health, we can't just list the factors and say, well, first factor, well, there are changed circumstances, so rezoning is good. We have to say, what is it? How are they changed? Give us examples. Give us a list of why you reach those conclusions. So that's the purpose of the resolution that you have in front of you. Number one, hitting every one of the factors or standards that's listed in the ordinance, giving a finding that the Planning Commission reached, and saying why the Planning Commission reached the conclusions on those standards. And I think key to the findings of the Planning Commission were some of the reasons that were repeated in multiple standards, multiple findings, as in the changed circumstances of the property. Since the property in question was originally zoned agricultural or rural residential, have circumstances in that area changed? Absolutely, they have. Public water and public sewer being extended to the property is a huge change, a huge changed factor of significance. The demand for housing is another significant factor that has changed since the land was originally zoned as it is, and then blueberry farming becoming maybe more competitive than it has in the past, and maybe more obnoxious to the neighborhood than it was in the past because of the encroaching residential development. So those factors are repeated a couple of different times as reasons for the decisions reached by the Planning Commission on the standards that are in the zoning ordinance. And certainly one of the significant factors that the Planning Commission must consider, and you must consider, is the compatibility of the rezoning request with the master plan. Lucas did a very nice job with that. The master plan process included a community survey. It included input of reducing intensity of housing and preserving the rural character of the township, and the Planning Commission responded to that by significantly increasing the areas planned for rural residential. But as part of that, if we're going to be good stewards of our community resources, we have to also find where do we meet the demands of the people who continue to want to come here, and the people who live here and want to share the tax burden and the infrastructure cost burden, and fill the schools that are looking for students. We have to look where, if we're going to preserve more land for rural residential, where are we going to find residential development? And it would seem to be the area that's adjacent to existing development, the area that's ready to be served by public water and public sewer, the area with roads that are adequate according to the road commission to handle the demands of the development. So those were all of the findings the Planning Commission reached on the basis of the input received by the Planning Commission over 3 or 4 meetings, I'm not sure, but they long meetings, exhausting meetings for the Planning Commission where they did a lot of listening. And the Planning Commission also considered the arguments against the rezoning and looked at those arguments versus the evidence that was presented in favor of the rezoning. And then, as Lucas noted, there's not only the recommendation to rezone the P5 property, but to not rezone the other property because it's not as ready and it's not as in demand, and there isn't any need to do that. That's not to say it never will be, but there will be a time to consider that, and this isn't the time according to the Planning Commission.
So we're in discussion now?
Yeah, it's a great time. I know this, some of the questions, any opportunity, any questions.
So
I want to share that too. Ellen, I'm so sorry. I think right now is the time to ask every question, the arsenal, unload everything you've got so that we can get the information that we need while we've got the experts that are here, because, I mean, we've got to know as well. So, okay.
So we have talked a lot about the criteria that was considered by the Planning Commission, and that's included in Attorney Balchi's resolution. My main concern, I have several, but my main concern is criteria E. The rezoning of the property will allow land uses which will be compatible with physical, geographical, hydrological, and other environmental aspects. The problem I have is all of that property is well within the Spring Lake watershed. And I don't understand how we can have, maybe I don't know what went on behind the scenes with the Planning Commission, but I don't see data that shows us that that's okay, that the amount of runoff.
No, we're not going to have that. We are going to have a civilized meeting, period. Thank you.
So, I mean, if I'm thinking about it right, the runoff that we have today from the blueberry fields will get worse because we'll have impervious surfaces. Impervious surfaces including roofs and sidewalks and streets. And all that water has nowhere to go except for into Spring Lake.
Can I respond to that? So I think what we have to understand is that, And I can just lay it out in simple terms because Kevin can speak in more detail, but I can do the general overview that you'll be able to understand. The starting point for the Drain Commissioner, Water Resources Commissioner is the development will not increase the runoff. That is a requirement. There's not going to be development there if it increases the runoff. That means, yeah, there is more impervious surfaces, but the developer is going to have to accommodate that, whether it's retention ponds, detention ponds, a stormwater system, whatever. If the development is going to increase water runoff, the development's not going to get off the ground. We're not going to get the calculations, we're not going to see the detail until we're looking at an actual plan, because you can't do the detail or the calculations until you have an actual plan. And that would be premature, because then we're approving a plan as opposed to the rezoning. But the big picture is the Water Resources Commissioner will be responsible to make sure that the development does not exacerbate any runoff problem. Am I correct, Kevin?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I guess I'm just having a hard time visualizing that because I don't know where the water will go. If we say it doesn't go into Spring Lake, where's it going to go?
I think as Ron mentioned, I mean, they'll have standards in there that they'll have to handle that through stormwater retention, detention, and water quality standards that they need to handle. So they'll be building ponds, you know, similar to what you've seen in other developments, such as Arcadia or other ones that have been built throughout the years. And actually the standards the Water Resources has adopted in the last, I think in 2016, I believe they incorporated additional water quality standards in there, in addition to just runoff. So they're covered by those requirements.
In addition to that, the township actually, even though the township is really not in the business of regulating water runoff, we do have an agreement that requires the developer to, if the developers are part to sign, to guarantee that there won't be problems. So we essentially have, if the Water Resources Commissioner says I'm too busy to deal with that, we've got our own enforcement ability to address that.
And to build on that too, there's the maintenance agreement that's required. So over the long term, so stormwater systems shall be maintained, and if they're not maintained, then the township has the ability to go in and maintain those at the cost of the development.
The other thing we can do, as Attorney Volchi said, we have, the board has the ability to make whatever decision you want. If you want to study that, if you want to study that issue or another issue, or if you want to spend a month, 2 months, 3 months, you know, if you want to look at, okay, where does the runoff that is there currently, where does it go? What is the future? We could estimate how much impervious surface would be likely. I say that. So the thing I want to be careful of is we certainly can study any of these things further. I think the challenge we sometimes get into is, you know, who should pay for studying that more? And if the concern is, well, if we say, well, we want the developer to pay for that, well, then if the answer that comes back, somebody may say, well, they just got the answer they were looking for. If the township pays for it, people may say, well, now we're spending tax dollars for the benefit of a developer in some way. I would suggest that if we have some studies that we want to do, much like we did with the sewer study, we ought to at least do the study with the folks that we already have.
Yeah, but couldn't we put that requirement with the PUD process? Why would we want?
I'm just kind of responding to one of those questions about when do we have to do those kinds of things. It absolutely could be done as that could be a requirement of the PUD. It could be a requirement prior to that if you want.
But I'm going to ask a question of the board. Before we go and spend all the money and do all those things, strategically, is this the right fit for our community?
What, the rezoned R2?
Correct.
We decided that pretty much when we approved the master plan.
Correct. But we're going to go through the process, get public input. We get public input. We have the right to turn this down, correct?
Yeah.
You have the right to, well, you have the right to turn it down. My job is to make sure if you do something, or at least do my best to ensure that if you do something, it's defensible in court. So if you are going to turn it down, it would have to be on the basis of the factors that the Planning Commission used, and you would have to come to different conclusions based on the evidence in front of you.
So, to rephrase what you said, I think we have a lot more information now than we had when we talked about the revisions to the master plan.
Correct. I would agree.
So you're saying that knowing the information now, you may not have voted that way back then?
She didn't.
Or not you?
I would not. I definitely would not.
Okay, well, the fortunate and unfortunate situation is it's before us right now. So we are going to have to move forward with some type of an action. Whether it's a thumbs down or a thumbs up, I don't know. But we can't just bury it and stall it.
Correct. But we do have options, right?
Well, the options are either you accept the Planning Commission's recommendation of R2, or you decide that possibly we want to go to R1, or we reject everything altogether. And there will be consequences to every decision made. Personally, this was looked at, and there's watershed throughout the whole township. And I've been doing this long enough to know that the Water Resources Commissioner does an amazing job with studying this and making sure the water runs and flows where it needs to. Because especially with the high water table that we had, I mean, there were a lot of neighborhoods that were sitting underwater, and Joe Bush and his team, and we paid for it. I personally paid for it with Wildwood Springs. I know other neighborhoods that have what Lovell has. There have been a lot of neighborhoods that have been improved and fixed. And this development will be no different. I mean, there are many different ways to require them to keep their water to themselves.
I think that's kind of the issue. Part of me feels like this decision is made. Like, it's in the master plan. You approved the master plan. They bought the land. Convenient timing on a future land use change for the Pool family. Sell right away. Great. Make all the money you can. I respect that. And then all of a sudden, we've got this zoning change before us, but because it went through the planning commission, now if we reject it, there's consequences at every step of the way, which means financial consequences in addition to other consequences. So I feel between a rock and a hard place of I've got people emailing me about water in their basement. I don't have a good answer for them, but then if I say no, I'm in litigation. So it's just not a fun place to be right now.
This is a challenging location, a challenging spot, and that's the benefit of being a very attractive community. Is people want to be here. There is a lot of demand for spaces.
Carolyn mentioned that we have obviously options. I totally agree with you. You mentioned that we have the option of R1. In fact, R1 is only 20% less in density than R2. So we also have the option of RR.
So I just want to interject for a moment, because I feel very much like Annie feels that we're all really in a very tough predicament. This is not a very popular comment to be made, but our planning commission has brought to us the heavy lifting. They did all the dirty work, they did all the study, and they've done everything to present to us their recommendations. They've gone through a grueling task to get it here. And I agree with Andy. You can have a thumbs up or a thumbs down. There's going to be consequences either way we go forward. But the fact of the matter is the Planning Commission has offered us a recommendation, and that is their job. And it's our board's job to either fight the facts, like Ron has said, what they presented us, or we're just going to have to take a thumbs up or a thumbs down vote, but we're going to have some kind of factual information to counter it. That's how I look at it. It's an unfortunate situation to be in, I understand, but that's where we're at right now.
So, Ron, what are the consequences of going to R1 or RR?
Well, some of it already is RR. So, I guess the potential, the consequences are we may get sued if we do anything. No matter what we do, we may get sued. So those are consequences of every decision you may make. I guess the relevant criteria to consider with RR would be, is RR consistent with the development that's in the area? Is it consistent with the infrastructure that's available? Is it consistent with the density that infrastructure could substantiate? And of course we'll look at this, would it provide a reasonable return on the investment in the land?
Why is it our job to make sure that P5 has a reasonable investment on the land?
If we don't accommodate an investor's reasonable expectations, we are essentially taking property, and that's in the Constitution. So we may take property, but we may do so only through due process and when we pay compensation for it. So we don't have the right to arbitrarily decide we're going to put in rules that are going to stop you from making money or from stop you from making a reasonable amount of money. That's what our system is built upon.
But isn't it a fact that every one of us who owns property, whether it's here in Spring Lake or we own vacation property somewhere or something, every one of us who buys property runs a risk that we don't get a return on our investment. We sell our property for less than we think it's worth, or less than we paid for it. That's a bummer, but isn't that a risk everybody runs?
Well, it is. Of course it is. And if you buy property, an investment property on a lake, and a dam in Midland breaks, and that lake is gone, that's a risk you take. Or that lake on which you bought property becomes polluted and it's no longer attractive, and your property value is cut in half. Those are risks that everyone takes, absolutely. The problem is, if we arbitrarily establish rules that take away property value, just because nature can take away property value doesn't give us the right to say, well, we're just going to do what we feel like. And if that ends up costing you money, we don't really care. We can't do that. That's arbitrary and capricious according to courts. We have to have reasons, and we have to have facts in the record.
So that's the operative word, arbitrarily.
Arbitrary and capricious. Yes, that's the phrase.
Mr. Supervisor, what I'd like to suggest is maybe if there are more questions, and that then we take a little bit of a break to get ready for our regular meeting. And I know our regular meeting starts off with public comments, and then we'll move into this as an agenda item. But I don't know if there are any more informal questions, comments.
I'd like to reiterate what Jerry said. The Planning Commission did go through this, and they struggled with it as well. And they looked at all the criteria. They looked at the information that they obtained from the school, the water resources, other. They looked at that. And when they went through the criteria based on all the information they were given, they came to us with what I thought was a compromise. They didn't go with what we asked them to do and look at the whole thing. They just said, look, we're only going to deal with the request at hand. We're not going to rezone everything because for the reasons in the resolution that you read. So I think we're going to look at the same criteria, and I don't know how we can come up with a different answer based on the information that we have, which is our planning commission to go through. It was, as I said, it wasn't easy for them either, because I've heard many of those commissioners say, this is the toughest thing I've ever had to do on the planning commission yet. But they did that, they made that decision they had 2 meetings in the middle school. I mean, it's not like, and they listened for like 4 months. It's not like they didn't listen and hear. They did. They did what they needed to do based on the information they had. And I don't think that we can just turn around and discount their work. My opinion.
I'm certainly not suggesting we discount the work. I think that it's our job as a board to dig deeper. It's our job to look at it from a broader perspective. And it's our job to listen to the people and our residents. So I think we have a different job. And for that reason, we could come to a different conclusion.
I don't know, because you have the same set of criteria.
We have the same set of criteria, but I'm not sure we have empirical data that leads me to believe that this criteria is met.
And a lot of times you're not going to get that until you get into the PUD process. Because I have been on these boards, I've been on the planning commission, and there have been PUDs that have come before us that never saw the light of day. And I can think of at least 2 or 3 offhand in my 20 years. So it's not that the stuff isn't looked at if and when it comes to that. We have made some developers jump through a few hoops.
Couple of points. I think. Sure, I can do that. Is that better? I spent an awful lot of time out there looking at this property and looking at all of the comments and complaints that have been brought forth, and some of them I think are valid. But I think the most valid one I've seen is that the R2 district would be compatible with the area. And I think I disagree with that, that the area is compatible. It is a rural area. It needs to continue that rural look. Now, my thinking in this is that it will be developed, and it should be developed using the assets or the land that we're given correctly. I really feel that an R1 is more compatible with that, and
and giving that a little bit more room, so it looks a little bit more like the surrounding area. There's way more R1 out there than there is R2. And the R2 that is out there is because of nature and creeks and ponds and wetlands that are there. It changes the topographics of that. This is going to be just one big sheet of land. Everything's got to be built on. So I'm thinking that a R1 is much more compatible with the area. That's just my sense.
So, Gordon, what if other board members were to maybe be more receptive to an R1 without making the planning commission feel like they were stepped on potentially?
Here's what I'd like to suggest, just from a timing standpoint. I think you've had the beginning of dialogue that you're going to continue to have as this agenda item comes up. It's about 5 minutes to 7. What I'm thinking is that you're going to hear public comment at the beginning of your meeting, and then that item will be, I think, the rest of the board members getting a sense of how they feel about that. I don't know if that helps. What I heard from our attorney is you have the full spectrum. That's one of the potential outcomes.
Okay. Anybody have any final questions that they want to ask before we go into a small recess? Okay, we're going to recess until 7 p.m.